Okay, hello and good morning. So we're going to start with chapter 55 on species interactions. So when two different species live in the same proximity, it's pretty much inevitable that they're going to interact in some way when they encounter each other. And whenever you have two species interacting, they're both going to experience effects from that interaction, but those effects may vary. So we're going to talk about some common types of interactions among species, what we would call, in particular, we're going to talk about interspecific interactions. That's an E, by the way. So when I say interspecific, that means two different species. If I was to say intra, that means the same species. Because you can have both types of interactions, right? Two organisms of the same species, like these two wolves we see here, could be interacting with each other in some way. And then we could have interspecific interactions where these wolves and these bears interact in some way. For the most part, we're going to talk about interspecific interactions in this little chapter. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different types, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these before. So we have predation, we have competition, and we have some what we would call positive interactions. Okay, so those are kind of the three really broad categories, but we can actually even subdivide those even further. So predation is any kind of predator-prey relationship. We'll move these for now. And so the effects of predator-prey relationships is what we call plus-minus relationship, where one organism is going to benefit, and really this table sums everything up perfectly. One organism benefits while the other very much is harmed. So in probably what you would think of as the most obvious type of predation, what we call carnivory, this is where one animal eats another animal. So a good example of this would be carnivores like wolves are going to eat and kill other types of animals. And of course the wolves benefit, they get food, and the organism that is eaten obviously is eaten, it dies, so it is harmed. But another kind of predation we don't often think of as being predation is herbivory, and this is where the animal eats either the whole plant or parts of the plant. And again, it's a plus-minus relationship. The plant is very much harmed, possibly killed, and the animal gets food, so it is benefited. Another type of interaction that falls under the broad category of predation is parasitism. So parasitism is a parasite-host relationship. So predation can include carnivory, animal eating animal. It can include herbivory, animal eating plant, or it can include parasitism, which is some kind of parasite host. And the parasite lives on, feeds off the host, and usually doesn't kill it, not at least immediately, but the parasite benefits and the host is harmed. So that sets up the whole plus-minus narrative that is predation. So some herbivory examples would be this buffalo is eating the grass on the savanna. So that's herbivory, and of course the grass that's eaten is dead, so it is negatively affected. Parasitism can also be seen in this picture as well. So you can't see the parasites because they're very tiny, as parasites tend to be. So this buffalo is infested with ticks that live on the buffalo and suck blood off the buffalo. And they don't outright kill the buffalo usually, but they certainly harm the buffalo. So still that plus minus narrative. And there's lots of types of parasites, some of which we would call ectoparasites that live outside the organism, like ticks, and some which we call endoparasites. So if it's an ectoparasite, it's living outside the host on its skin or something. If it's an endoparasite, it's living inside. So we're talking something like a tapeworm or something lovely like that. So predation, somebody's getting hurt or killed. So let's talk about competition. So competition is a minus-minus interaction. Both are worse off for the interaction. So why would they do it? Well, because they want the same resource. So an example of competition would be the grizzly bears and these wolves. They both want that kill. So the bear here is trying to take it over. So both the wolves and the bear are negatively impacted by competition because they're, fighting over the same food resource. And we also have competition happening, I'm sure, among these plant species, although you can't see it. They're competing for underground resources like nutrients and water. And if there was other taller plants that might, compete for the sun. So competition happens all the time in nature because there's only so much food and water and, nesting sites to go around, and organisms are going to compete over those. So then we also have a broad category of interactions we would call facilitations, or positive interactions. So this is where nobody is harmed and at least one or maybe both benefit. So kind of the most beneficial of all is called a mutualism. That is a plus-plus. Both organisms benefit from the relationship. And so a good example of this is the birds on this, the back of this ox are eating those ticks. So that benefits, I'm sorry, it's a buffalo. So that benefits that buffalo because it's reducing its parasite load, but it also benefits the bird because they're getting a meal. Another good example of mutualism would be between flowering plants and the pollinators that visit them, right? The pollinators, like the bees, get the nectar from the flower, and the flower gets its reproduction, its gametes spread around by that pollinating insect. Excuse me. So it's a plus-plus. Everybody's benefiting. So that's good. There's also what's called commensalism. So commensalism is what we call a +0 relationship. So somebody benefits and somebody is unaffected. So a good example of this is where, for example, the buffalo is walking around, and as it walks around, it kicks up insects in the grass. And the little egrets, those little birds down here, are kind of hanging out because they're waiting for the buffalo to kick up those insects so they can eat them. Now the egret is benefited because it's getting food. The buffalo, it doesn't hurt it, it doesn't help it, it doesn't even notice it probably one way or the other, it's just walking. So that's a commensalism. And then there's what we call an amensalism, which is technically not a positive interaction for at least one organism. So an amensalism it is kind of its own sort of category, really, because one organism is hurt and the other is not affected. So an example of amensalism is that this buffalo is destroying insect nests as it's walking around. And that's obviously bad for the insects. The buffalo it doesn't help the buffalo. It's not trying to destroy the insect nest. It doesn't care. It's just walking. So that would be an example of an amensalism. Oh, by the way, a word you're going to see pop up a lot is symbiotic. Symbiotic. So That is just when two organisms live in very close relationship. So like the ticks on the back of the buffalo, or we could even have what we call an endosymbiotic relationship, where one animal or one organism lives inside the other, lives actually inside each other. So like a tapeworm living inside a dog, that'd be an endosymbiotic relationship, because one organism is actually living inside the other. Okay, so we're going to kind of, now that we've sort of broadly gone over these main categories, let's talk a little bit about each one in a little more detail, and what it means for some of the interesting evolutionary adaptations we see happening. So let's start with predation, which leads to numerous adaptations seen in both the predators to help them be more successful at catching prey, and in the prey to help them not get caught or not get killed. So let's talk about the predators first. So some predator strategies that have evolved over time would include things like active pursuit. So we see things like speed evolving in our predators, and the ability to track and follow prey. So active pursuit just means I'm chasing you, and predators are quite good at this. There's also what we call the sit and wait predator. So this amphibian here, its strategy, because it's not fast, is to just sit very quietly, very stilly, and wait for prey to come within proximity of striking distance. Some other predator strategies we see is venom, and my marker is giving out on me, hold on. So venom, right, think of a snake, think of a spider, some kind of poison to actually, so if they get a hold of their prey, one strike will be enough, because they'll inject venom and kill them. Also mechanical advantages. So this would be things like fangs, like jaws, claws. Even we could put speed in this category. And another thing that most predators have is increased intelligence. That's another thing that evolved in predators, the ability to have intelligence to kind of outwit their prey. And if you ever watch nature shows, you can see that the predator is quite good at sort of anticipating which way the prey will go or what they will do, and kind of strategizing. And if one strategy isn't working out, it will switch its strategy. So they have that intellectual flexibility, to try to get their prey. In turn, the prey species have also evolved, and this has been something of a evolutionary arms race over time, right? The predator evolves speed, so the prey evolves to get faster as well. So prey strategies would include speed to flee. Okay, so as the predator gets faster, so does the prey. Flight, so that's a great way that prey can get away. And they also can have mechanical defenses, so things like tough skin, shells, spines, like we see on this porcupine. Also being very good at avoiding detection, and chemical defenses. Right, so the predators might have evolved a chemical defense like venom, but the prey can also evolve a chemical defense like a poison, that if you eat me or if you take a bite out of me, it's going to be a problem. So let's talk about avoiding detection for a second. So for prey, one way they avoid detection is something called crypsis, which is camouflage. That is what we call it when a prey species matches its environment so that they can't be seen. So anything that makes the prey difficult to see. We also see some pretty effective chemical defenses. So many species that are small, weak, or maybe they're sessile, which means sessile, you'll see that word come up a lot. Sessile means you can't move, right? So something like a barnacle, you're stuck in place. So a lot of organisms that fall in this category where they can't really run or they can't really fight have evolved chemical defenses or other toxins to deter predators. So some good examples would be, there's many, let me go back a second, or species of tropical frogs that have evolved poisons that will secrete from their skin. There's also, this is a cool example, this is called the bombardier beetle, and they actually spray a noxious spray from their abdomen here, so you see it's coming out here, and this is toxic and potentially fatal to anything that's trying to attack it. And of course, we're all familiar with the skunk, whose musk is a deterrent to almost any predator. Humans don't have a particularly great sense of smell compared to other animals, and so we all know how much of a deterrent, the smell of a skunk is. So imagine if you're this fox with a very sensitive sense of smell right next to this skunk, it's going to be pretty effective. So, along with chemical defenses, lots of prey have evolved warning colorations, because being poisonous does not do you much good if you've been eaten, right? So if you're a poison, say you're one of these frogs that secretes poison from your skin, well, if the only way for the predator to know that is to actually eat you, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good because you're dead. So what they've also evolved along with their toxin is a warning coloration. We call it aposematic coloration. So it's almost like the opposite of camouflage. It makes you stick out. And so basically this serves as a warning flag to predators that, hey, I'm poison, so you don't want to eat me. Now, interestingly, this warning coloration, so this was a aposematic coloration, we'll call a warning coloration. This has led to two types of mimicry. So mimicry is when one species evolves to, I spelled that wrong, sorry, is when one species evolves to copy, to look like another species. Right, they're copying what they look like. So the two types of mimicry are known as Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. So Batesian mimicry, a harmless species looks like a dangerous species. The idea being that a predator will see it and not eat it because they're like, oh, that's the venomous species. But it's just mimicry. It doesn't really have the poison to back it up. So it's kind of brilliant because it has the benefit of the predator leaving it alone, but it doesn't have to go through all of the, expense, the metabolic expense of producing a poison. So here's an example of Batesian mimics. So we have this little harmless organism called a blenny, and the stripes on it, and really it looks quite strikingly like a closely related venomous species. And this species is venomous. This one isn't. This guy doesn't have any poison to back it up. Just looks a lot, this little guy just looks a lot like the venomous species, so it gets left alone for that reason. So that is Batesian mimicry. There's also something called Mullerian mimicry. I think I'm technically supposed to have a little umlaut there. Okay. So this is when two or more dangerous species resemble each other. So they sort of converge on the same warning sign. So what they're giving you, this picture here in South America, they're showing pairs of different species of butterflies, and both species are toxic. They're different species, even though their patterns are remarkably the same. And it's because they've converged on the same warning flag. So like the idea is that the more common the warning flag is, the more effective it will be. You know, the more quickly predators will say like, oh, when I see this pattern, I leave it alone. So it's effective for both of the species to converge on this same warning sign of don't eat me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about herbivory. So herbivory is kind of a specialized form of predation. So we have here an animal eats some of the plant, but usually most of the plant remains alive. Animal, whoops. This is when an animal eats a plant. And again, typically, you know, typically it's eating parts of the plant. And the plant actually remains alive. There certainly could be cases where it just pulls up the whole plant and eats the whole thing. It varies, but usually usually it's parts of a plant. So herbivory has led to specialized adaptations in both the herbivore and the plants as well. On the case of the animal, we see things like, you know, grinding teeth that are adapted to grinding up tough plant material. We see also usually some kind of gut symbiont. Right, animals can't break down the cellulose of a plant, so a lot of times there'll be a microorganism living in their gut to help them break it down. We also see things like a very tough skin in the mouth to tolerate you know, the tough skin or the spines on a plant, and tolerance of toxins. Lots of plants have evolved poisons to try to keep them from being eaten. On the place of the plant, we see lots of adaptations as well, and you can just take a stroll outside and find these all over the place. So things like spines, thorns, chemicals, so it's got toxin, bad taste. All these things have evolved to help keep something from trying to eat it. Okay, so finally on the topic of predation, let's talk about parasitism, which is a cool subject. So parasitism oftentimes leads to pretty rapid evolution because typically the parasite is living in very close proximity to the host, either on it or in it. So parasites have evolved some really interesting abilities to make them able to live with their host long term. So they've evolved abilities to evade the host immune system. And when we talk later, and when we get to the animals chapter, we're going to talk about a lot of parasitic worms and things and other endoparasites and how they've evolved to trick and evade host immune systems to not attack them. They're also, if they're an ectoparasite living outside, they're really, really good at hang on to host. Right? They're difficult to get, you know, just scratching doesn't usually get you off. So what you're looking at here, so these are whale lice. So you're looking at the skin of a gray whale, and these little critters are lice that are flattened dorsoventrally. So it means they're basically like flat, like a sandwich. And this makes them sort of more aerodynamic in the water, and they can hang on, and as the whale swims, they avoid water friction and they don't just get lost. Parasites have also evolved the ability to move host to host. So again, when we get to animals, we'll talk about some parasite life cycles that are quite involved, and often involve 2 or sometimes even 3 or 4 different host species they're jumping to. And also, they've evolved low virulence in many cases. So they're damaging to the host, but they make sure they're not too damaging because they don't want to kill the host, right? Because then they don't have anywhere to live. So having a low enough virulence to infect the host but not kill it is also important. So let's talk about the ways the hosts evolve in response to the parasite. So stronger immune systems. So this is, again, something of an evolutionary arms race, right? The host gets a better immune system, so then the parasite quickly evolves an ability to evade it, and then this keeps going and going. Ability to tolerate. So a lot of times, rather than getting rid of the parasite, we just evolve the ability, the host evolves the ability to live with it and be, more or less okay. And there's also systems to decrease parasite load. So one example we're seeing here is these Japanese macaques form social bonds that involve grooming partners. And so one partner literally will groom the other and pick the ectoparasites off the other individual. There's also, when we're talking about an ectoparasite, the evolution of hairlessness is thought to be an adaptation to avoid parasite load, and it's thought that humans, actually, this is one of the reasons that we're mostly hairless, is to avoid parasite load. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here, and we're going to pick up talking about competition in the next video, so see you soon.